place which is ours is where our troops stand. Troops move, and this place immediately goes into insurgents' hands, reported a Russian journalist of Moscow Bulletin from the front of a Russian conquest of the Caucasus. Going on for more than 63 years, from 1800 to 1863, it was one of the myriad Russian colonial wars that formed what we know today as the Russian Federation. Its sovereignty and integrity, the two most protected notions in Russian criminal law, is the highly volatile unity of colonized territories. The fragility of what is known as Russia is secured by endless wars of conquest waged over centuries. Their mechanic repetitiveness is daunting. What hope can one find today if Russia has annexed the Crimean Peninsula at least 4 times? What is it there in those 4 genocides on indigenous Crimean Tatars, with the first one dating 1783 and the last one ongoing since 2014? No matter how successful such invasions are as a singular event, their horrific frequency reveals the inability to break down the colonial resistance and secure desired integrity. To rephrase the quote I started with, the only place which is Russia is where its troops stand. Colonial warfare rests on the idea that it has tools to control time. Imperial powers like to think of themselves as massive machines that can bend time and space as they want. They imagine colonial invasions as fast battles to be won without much effort. Colonial regimes have developed an intricate sensorial apparatus, eyes and brains of missiles, drones, rifles, rovers, to impose speed. Thinkers of speed and acceleration follow the military lingua that believes in fast victories. What is described by Paul Varilya as dromology, the capacity to dominate the enemy through speed, has been called small wars by military thinkers since the 19th century. Such focus on speed misses the bigger pattern. These wars are recursive, even if fought fast. Racial superiority aspirations of quick victories face reality. Racial superiority aspirations of quick victories face reality that the chances of colonial victory in these wars is around 1/3 or even less than that. According to several extensive surveys of colonial invasions by the infamous US military think tank Rand Corporation, it is as likely that the colonial invasion will be totally defeated as it is that it is going to be won. 30% of victories seems surprisingly low for what is presented as undefeatable war machine that has technological solutions for any problem that battlefield presents. Military budgets of Russia, Israel, USA, truly astronomical in size, somehow do not translate into power that would break the colonial resistance once and for all. To understand how these colonial wars are defeated, one should focus on recursion rather than speed. As Anne-Laure Stoller suggested in her book on imperial durabilities, recursion is not exactly the same as repetition of identical scenarios and mistakes. Recursion is redeployment, the combination of the tools and means of colonial violence. It corresponds to the etymology of the word time, время, in Russian. In Proto-Slavic, the word for time, vremen, meant something that spins, that comes back to its initial position. Such recursive spinning is very apparent in colonial wars. Colonial invasions spin in the same direction. The Soviet war in Afghanistan, which from 1979 to 1989, despite all the enormous military resources thrown at it, was ultimately unsuccessful. It was spinning for a whole decade to come to the initial position. The same fate awaited Russia in its first invasion in Chechnya between 1994 and 1996. Technologies might change, but the tendency for the empire to be defeated remains. War criminals, weapons, strategies are quite literally redeployed from one war to another. They bring with them shortages, breaks, misconceptions that turn the tide of the conflict in the known direction. Colonial wars do not repeat themselves in the exact same manner, but they carry the ghosts of the past. And so the dead of one war haunt the dead of another. The recursive failures of conquest hit at the predefined course of colonial wars. There are so many wars waged by Russia that their logic is literally transparent when they are compared. As if made from glass, their structure is on display. One of the qualities of this structure is the overall precarity of control it grants. Wars are waged with an expiry date hardwired in their control. They are obsolete by design. No matter how violent Russian invasions are, their power breaks under fierce decolonial pressure. The fragility of Russian colonialism, akin to the one of thin sharp glass, doesn't make it less harmful. It inflicts wounds in line with the fragile nature of its structure. Its sharp shatters stick out from the layers of invasions, occupations, annexations, and genocides inflicted upon the same nations and lands that have never been defeated. Hence, Russian conquest is endless. Even an economic shock over the end of USSR could not stop Russian attempts to fill newly formed holes in its integrity with the bodies of those who dared to resist. From 1991 to 1993, although the government in Moscow was in disarray, it still dispatched forces to drop vacuum bombs on Georgian residential areas during the Georgian Civil War. From 1994 to 1996, barely having a structural conceptualization of a new capitalist state, Russia was already cleansing the civilians of Ичкерия, known today as Chechnya. Even though the Russian army was destroyed by Chechen resistance in 1986, in 1997, Russia gathered at least some troops to kill oppositional forces struggling for democracy in Tajikistan. The list goes on. The structure of the Russian wars is clear, but what is it? As analyzed by anti-colonial Chechen historian Abdurrahman Aftarkhanov in 1988, both Russian and Soviet empires never fought a colonial war. They were, I quote, fulfilling international duty, protecting themselves, or securing borders. A Chechen human rights activist, Abubakar Yanglbaev, has also recently noted the reluctance of Russia to name a war by its name. Comparing the Russian invasion of Chechnya and Ukraine, he highlights that both wars were called operations. He highlights other properties as well: the heightened resentment of Russian supremacy, mass killings of civilians, outdated warfare and lack of relevant skills, installment of a puppet government, and peace talks as a way to distract attention. These components constitute together a Russian colonial project, singular despite its complexity. As they are part of the same structure, these properties of colonial warfare are interconnected. I want to focus on two of them, seeming euphemisms for the word war and outdated weapons used by the Russian army. Looking into the relationship between the two, I would love to start dissecting the enormous harmful mechanism they make up. The reasons for the Russian colonial wars to be called something else are numerous. As both Aftarkhanov and Yanglbaev have noted, not only does it allow ascribing positive connotations to practical bloodshed, operations, activities, duties pretend to be immune to the loans of war. What is less rarely noted, according to Tarek Barkavi, a post-colonial historian of war, is that the very concept of war is never used outside of inter-imperial conflicts. It seems to be insulting for the imperial power to call invasions a colonial war, as it would mean accepting the enemy's equal status. War is reserved for those perceived as equal in the colonial metrics. Therefore, the terms usually bear diminutive collocation attached to it. it's never a war, it's a small war, low-intensity conflict, or it has a contained scale implicit in the term, like operation or activities. Not only the terms are reserved for inter-imperial conflicts, but military capabilities themselves. At least since the Second World War, Russian and Soviet armies have constantly been preparing to fight a war, meaning war against the West. The entire military has been tirelessly working to advance the means of fighting another nuclear superpower. The derivative depictions of colonial wars determine the inadequacy of weapons developed and deployed to fight them. As Russian soldiers who fought in Afghanistan recall, their vehicles would be a cutting-edge technology in the post-apocalyptic landscape of a nuclear war. These vehicles were practically useless in what was officially called activities the Soviet state undertook in Afghanistan. As Russian coloniality assumes inferiority of those it aims to colonize, the only enemy worth military preparation is another empire. The notion of superiority in warfare is implicated in a broader colonial mindset, which consists of various conceptions of superiority that overlap and inform one another. According to ℒ𝔲𝔰🔬🔢🔢, a historian of the British colonial wars, one of these conceptions is one of technological supremacy, one of the central pillars of Western imperialism. In his work, Wagner looks into the complex task of the British Empire to uphold the understanding of non-Western people as technologically inferior, despite their constant advances against its army. His work resonates with the Russian military principles, employing the entirety of Russian media to ridicule, I quote, the exotic, ancient, outlandish warfare of the Kurdish YPG and the Syrian opposition. Wagner explains that a colonial paradigm never accepts that its force was defeated due to technological superiority of resistance. Annihilation of troops is explained through the fanaticism of savage warriors that compensates for their inferior weapons. The inadequacy of imperial military technologies is ascribed to the enemy's racialized nature rather than the technologies themselves. Ideas of technological supremacy are as detached from reality as those of racial supremacy. The Russian military is constantly proved dysfunctional. Ideas of technological supremacy are as detached from reality as those of racial supremacy. The Russian military is constantly proved dysfunctional in combat, undergoing rapid restructuring while at war. The same revolution in military affairs happened over and over again, following devastated troops' losses. The most well-known reform the Russian army has undergone was after losing its war against Georgia in 2008. The less famous reforms of 2001-2004 followed the heavy losses in Ичкерия, and classified revolutions in the Soviet army were undertaken during the failed invasion of Afghanistan. One of the most radically restructured in these military revolutions has always been the intelligence technologies, despite the least publicly announced. These are prioritized as the mystery of the imaginary other backfires in the course of conquest. Colonial officers feel lost in their attempts to comprehend inscrutable land, as Priya Satya analyzes the aerial surveillance developed by the British colonial power in Pakistan. Making sense of the colonial stereotype they themselves created became a practically impossible task. Similarly, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Russian conquest of Ичкерия, and its contemporary invasion of Syria and Ukraine proved that Russians were lost in their ignorance towards those they aimed to control. There were not enough translators available in all these wars, maps were outdated, and the knowledge of those to be pacified was fragmented bits of intelligence. The known tactics of guerrilla resistance weaponized this asymmetry of information, ranging from discrete attacks to various forms of misinformation. The convergence of impossibility to understand the imaginary other and belief in technological superiority leads to investment into revolutionizing intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance technologies. As Priya Satie analyzes, the British saw a vast novel intelligence system as a cure-all against unreliable tribal observers ingrained in the more general system of Orientalist beliefs. They imagined that omniscience in the land of mystery could be achieved if they changed the vantage point with the technical means of the plane. Russia develops a similarly revolutionary intelligence system every time it launches a colonial invasion. Unprepared to kill the enemy it perceives as inferior, it cannot find anyone to aim its weapons at. In Afghanistan, the USSR revolutionized the very definition of intelligence, repurposing it from spying on the US to controlling more mobile dispersed resistance. As Russian General Mayor Yuri Kristovsky recalls, our intelligence technologies were not satisfactory at the beginning of the Afghan campaign with the too advanced mobile radio communication of resistance forces. We had to start basically from zero, if only to know where this zero is. Not knowing even the enemy's language, the Soviet army took several years to approach these issues technically. Similarly, a network of technical intelligence bases Center S was built by Russia in Syria to substitute reliable sources in locating oppositional forces for assassination. These systems, such as radio direction finding, aim to geolocate an enemy through technical characteristics of their communication rather than content exchanged. The idea of solving the colonial ignorance with repurposed and recalibrated machines of information extraction never works as planned. Augmented audio and visual sensors do not protect the troops, rather than welcome them into the same patterns of death. Death from friendly fire is the most telling example of how deaths repeat each other. Also referred to as fratricide, friendly fire is the act of troops accidentally killing each other. Unsurprisingly, it is a taboo subject in the military. Ironically, deaths from a friendly fire are the result of military attempts to prevent future deaths. Ways to stop friendly fire are the ones to cause deaths in future battles. Despite being rarely discussed, for a colonial soldier to be killed by another colonial soldier is a common way to die. The number of those deaths are extremely underreported due to the danger they present for the colonial state. Accepting how widespread the friendly fire is would shake the core propaganda narratives essential for recruiting soldiers and legitimizing these wars. Nevertheless, official reports estimate that friendly fire accounts for between 26 to 50% of all deaths in colonial forces. Soldiers acknowledge that friendly fire is a part of everyday combat. One can see various traces of this issue. In 2008, when Russia launched a military aggression against Georgia, it lost 6 military jets, but only 3 of them were shot down by Georgian forces. The other half was done by Russians themselves. Russian soldiers who invaded Afghanistan share how common the killings of fellow soldiers were. This is repeated in Russian accounts of the war in Chechnya. On New Year's Day in 1995, 2 columns of Russian troops proceeded in parallel, storming through the streets of Grozny, killing each other while destroying the city. Deaths. The grim aftermath of colonial wars do not have clear-cut beginnings and ends. As Karen Kaplan observed regarding the term aftermath only recently gained the grim meaning of what is left after the war. Aftermath initially was meant to obey the agricultural cycle. It meant cutting a second crop of grass to then be harvested. The math in aftermath is the act of mowing. As colonial powers deeply believe they have the power to break the rhythmic cycles of war, they push themselves into more and more deadly traps. They state, I quote, that friendly fire is a curse. Military thinkers themselves admit that the friendly fire is a product of highly efficient industrialized war. Soldiers do not engage in hand-to-hand combat and, unlike less well-trained militaries, shoot at each other without looking or thinking twice. Colonial powers tried to break the curse of death by making killing people more efficient, more deadly. It makes a circle. We start following this circle, they state. Friendly fire is caused by the fog of war, lack of reliable information on who is the enemy and where it is located. They throw more information at soldiers and their weapons, making them kill faster and more efficiently. Contemporary missiles turned into computers with explosives speed up the pace of war. Instead of breaking the circle, they make the war cycle faster while broadcasting it on multiple screens. Assured by GPS and lasers, colonial soldiers now feel more confident to slaughter each other. This sensory system aims to automate and reduce the human factor as much as possible. Nevertheless, such a system is always a complex structure of machines and, most importantly, people who would have at least some idea of the language and culture of those they surveil. Those people are always scarce. Russian intelligence soldiers that took part in the invasion of Ichkeria confirmed that they made no progress in learning the language, as this was never posed as a task. As one account goes, Chechen people had an indisputable advantage. They knew the Russian language and could use it to misinform us, but we could not do the same against using Chechen. The substitution of knowledge gathering about Chechen resistance with technical advancements did not convert into more efficient control. If anything, it strengthened Russian delusions rather than military capabilities. This has been an open secret for those resisting Russian invasions. Chechen people, referred to as aborigines by Russian soldiers, were hacking into their radio communication to give false fire coordinates. Frequently directing Russian troops to shoot at each other, they remained unnoticed, shielded by the impossibility for a Russian soldier to imagine a Chechen hacker. Today, Russian troops are shelling their own positions in Ukraine. Constantly intercepted, they hear false commands, anthems, and haunting robotic children. Auto-generated kids, cracking and delaying with the radio waves they're being broadcasted on, ask invaders in Russian on repeat. Russian soldiers, stand back. Do you really believe it all makes sense? This is not your war.
Русские солдаты, отойдите. Вы действительно верите, что это имеет смысл. Это не ваша война. Русские солдаты, отойдите. Вы действительно верите, что это имеет смысл. Это не ваша война. ℜ𝔲𝔰💄𝔬🩦 как принимаешь мою работу, прием? Русские солдаты, отойдите. Вы действительно верите, что это имеет смысл. Это не ваша война. Русские солдаты, отойдите. Вы действительно верите, что это имеет смысл. Это не ваша война. ℜ𝔲𝔰💄𝔬🩦 я 48, 88.